It was now, as nearly as I could calculate, about 10 o'clock in the day. The heat was tempered by the fog and the sea breeze, and I promised myself to reach the mountain top before sunset. Making straight across the beach to a point where the cliffs looked somewhat lower and more broken than elsewhere, I succeeded in climbing up the face of the rock without much difficulty, and in gaining the skirts of the palm forest above. Here I flung myself down in the shade, and proceeded to examine the contents of my pockets. The brandy, ammunition, and other loose stores were lost with the boat, but I found that I was still in possession of all that I had stowed about my person. One by one I brought out my tinder-box, telescope, pocket compass, clasp knife, and other trifles, all of which, except the compass, which was enclosed in a tight tin case, were more or less damaged by the sea-water. As for the biscuit, it was reduced to a nauseous pulp, which I flung away in disgust, preferring to trust to the coconuts for my subsistence. Of these I saw hundreds clustered overhead, and being by this time quite ready for breakfast, I climbed the tree against which I had been lying, brought down 3 or 4 nuts, and made a delicious meal. I then unscrewed and cleaned the glasses of my telescope, consulted my compass, and prepared to continue my journey. Finding by the position of the needle that the north lay to the right, following the line of shore below, I concluded that I must have swum to land at some point of the eastern extremity of the bay where I had hoped to anchor. This being the case, I had but to march due west in order to arrive at the foot of the mountain, which I proposed to myself as the object of my first day's exploration. Due west I turned accordingly, and, compass in hand, took my way through the green shade of the forest. Here the coolness, the silence, the solitude were perfect. I could not hear my own footsteps for the moss that carpeted the ground, and though I saw several birds of brilliant plumage, they uttered no kind of note, but sat like painted creatures on the boughs, and looked at me without any sign of fear. Once or twice I saw a small, long-tailed monkey flitting like a squirrel through the uppermost tree-tops, but it was gone in a moment, and seemed only to make the place more wild and solitary. On every side, like graceful columns supporting the roof of some vast temple, rose hundreds of slender palm stems, ringed with the natural record of their yearly growth, whilst here and there, through openings in the boughs, came glimpses of blue sky and shafts of golden sunlight. When I had walked thus for about 1.5 miles, finding the atmosphere growing clearer and brighter at every step, I suddenly emerged upon a grassy plain studded with trees like an English park, and traversed by a small winding river that glittered like moving silver in the open sunshine. Beyond this plain, at the distance of about another 1.5 miles, lay a second forest, more extensive apparently than the first, and beyond that again, defined so clearly against the deep blue sky that I could almost have believed I might touch it with my hand, rose a steep and rugged peak, clothed halfway up with trees, and surmounted by some kind of building, with a beacon on the top. The height of this peak I calculated at something less than 2,000 feet. I recognized it at once as the same which I had sighted from the masthead of the Mary Jane at sunrise that morning. I also recognized the plain and river, each lying in its proper geographical position according to the chart. Finding my every hope becoming corroborated as I went on, I now made no question as to the result of my undertaking, but pushed gaily forward and amused myself by speculating about the treasure. Where should I find it? In what form? Perhaps we should have to mine for it. And in that case I made up my mind to seek all round the island, if necessary, for some safe harbour in which to anchor the Mary Jane. I should then land all my crew, build a few temporary huts, and set the men hard to work at digging and smelting, till our little ship would hold not another ingot. This done, I would sail straight for Jamaica, lodge my treasure in some colonial bank, purchase a large vessel, engage a numerous crew, and return at once for a fresh cargo of riches. What was to prevent me, indeed, from coming again and again, and carrying hence such wealth as no king or kaiser in all the world could boast? Absorbed in dreams of untold grandeur and power, I felt neither fatigue nor heat, nor was conscious of the miles I traversed. There was now no fog, nor sign of fog, and the atmosphere was magically clear and bright. A soft air blew from the west. The rich grass of the savannah was thick with flowers. Even the mossy glades of the second forest were radiant with purple and scarlet berries, which I dared not taste, although they gave out a delicious odor. This forest proved more extensive than the first, and was more closely planted. All at once, just as I began to wonder how much farther it would lead me, I found myself upon the inner verge of the woods, with a strange and startling panorama before my eyes. The forest terminated abruptly about half a mile from the foot of the mountain, and lay round it in one vast circular sweep, a zone of living green. Between these woods and the mountain lay the domes, obelisks, and ivy-mantled walls of a noble city, all deserted and in ruins. In the midst of these ruins rose the great solitary mountain towards which I had been journeying so long. More ruins were clustered about the base of it, and for some way up the lower slopes and buttresses of its sides. Above these came trees and underwood, and, towering higher still against the sky, a lofty peak of rock and rugged precipice. Examining this peak by the aid of my telescope, I saw some kind of small white edifice upon the very summit, surmounted apparently by a pyramidal ornament, supporting a glittering beacon. This beacon was the same that I had seen scintillating in the morning light. On reaching the inner verge of the first forest, I observed it long and earnestly. Was it made of glass, or of some reflecting metal? Did it revolve? Or were these brilliant flashes, which seemed almost as if emanating from its very substance, mere refractions of the sunlight? These were questions which I found it impossible to solve without nearer observation. I could only turn my eyes away, dazzled and half-blinded, and then press forward, more eagerly than ever, on my way. A few yards brought me to a huge mound of shattered masonry, which, as far as I could see, ran all round the ruins like a line of fortification, in some places higher, in some lower, and overgrown in every part with trees and creeping plants. Having scrambled over this first obstacle, I found myself close against the remains of a lofty circular building, with a domed roof. The portals of this building were carved with strange hieroglyphics, and the dome yet showed traces of faded gold and colors. Finding the entrance choked with fallen rubbish, I passed on as quickly as the uneven nature of the ground would permit, and came next upon a small quadrangular edifice, built as it seemed of the purest white marble, and engraved all over with arabesques, and mythologic birds and beasts. Being unable to distinguish any kind of entrance, I concluded that it was a tomb. Then came another domed temple, the roof of which was plated with what looked like sheets of solid gold. Then a vast number of tombs all together, some of white, some of red, and some of green marble. Then a hillocky space of undistinguishable debris. Then an obelisk inlaid with various kinds of jasper and onyx, and then, partly built up against, and partly excavated in, the rocky base of the central peak, close beneath which I was now standing, a building of grander dimensions than any I had yet seen. The front, defaced as it was, rose to a clear height of at least 300 feet. The great entrance was supported on either side by a colossal stone image, half man, half eagle, which, though buried in rubbish halfway to the knees, yet stood full 50 feet clear in sight. From the middle of the roof rose a kind of low, broad pyramid, fantastically ornamented in gold and colors. In this temple I felt sure I should find treasure. My only difficulty would be to force an entrance. The great portals were literally blocked up by a mass of broken sculpture that seemed to have fallen from the facade immediately above the entrance. Over and among the rubbish and debris had grown a tangled mass of underwood, trailing plants, and huge prickly growths of the cactus tribe. The hand of man could scarcely have barricaded the approach to the sanctuary of his gods more effectually than time and decay had done. With only a pocket-knife, I knew that it would be hopeless to attempt to cut my way through such a jungle. I therefore left the front and made a survey of the temple from the sides where it projected from the face of the rock. Even this was no easy matter, for the area all about it was strewn with great mounds of bush-grown rubbish, over which I had to climb as I best could, without heeding how my hands and face were wounded in the effort. All this time I could see no sign of any openings or windows, by which the building could have been lighted, or any other doorway than the great entrance on the other side. At length it occurred to me that I might find some means of penetrating to the interior of the building by climbing that part of the mountain against which it was reared, and finding some way of dropping down upon the roof. So I went on a little farther, to a point where the ascent looked somewhat less difficult than elsewhere, and succeeded in clambering up to a ledge that commanded the roof of the temple. It lay before me like a vast terrace, with the pyramid in the midst. Comparatively free from the rubble that strewed every foot of the ground below, it was only grass-grown and mossy, with a few young trees and bushes springing up here and there where the dust of ages had deposited sufficient nourishment for their roots. I sprang down upon it, and proceeded to reconnoitre the surface from end to end, taking good care all the while, lest I should step on some weak spot, and be precipitated into the chasm below. It was well that I did so. Having gone half-way along from the back towards the front, and left the pyramid a few feet behind me, I came suddenly upon what seemed like a great pit, over the edges of which the bushes clung suspended, and linked their tangled boughs together, as if they feared to fall. I drew back startled, for another step would have carried me over. I peered in. All below was dark and unfathomable. I traced the boundaries of the pit and found that it was an oblong parallelogram, constructed evidently for the purpose of giving light to the interior. Here, then, was an unobstructed opening into the building, but one of which it would be impossible to avail myself without the aid of a ladder. I tore away a bush that grew at the verge of the chasm, and flinging myself down at full length, shaded my eyes with one hand and looked into the abyss below. For some minutes I could see nothing. All seemed intensely dark, like the crater of an extinct volcano. At length, one dim outline after another became faintly visible. I distinguished mounds of stones and rubbish, which had probably fallen from the inside of the ceiling, and the lower limbs of another colossal figure, the upper part of which I could only have seen by descending into the building. It was in vain that I leaned over till another inch would have caused me to lose my balance. It was in vain that I tested the strength of every bush and creeper all round the opening. This was all that I had gained, or could hope to gain, in return for my labor in mounting there. I rose at last, slowly and reluctantly, and paused to think what it was best for me next to do. The city lay at my feet. The mountain rose high above my head. At the level on which I now stood, and for some distance higher up the mountainside, were scattered several more of those small buildings which I had concluded must be places of sepulture. Should I examine these, in the hope of finding some access to the probable treasures buried with the dust of their inmates? Or should I pursue my first design of ascending the peak, planting the English flag on the summit, and beginning my explorations with a thorough observation of the whole city and surrounding country? I did not waste much time in hesitation. I felt as yet almost unwearied, despite my exertions and my long night's watch, and I decided for the ascent. It was a difficult task, and needed all the energy and perseverance of which I was to master. The first 200 yards or so, where the slope was less abrupt, and the terraces were covered with buildings, were comparatively easy, and here I could not resist turning aside for a few minutes, to examine a tomb which seemed to be more dilapidated than any which I had yet encountered. As I drew nearer, I found that it bore every mark of having been broken open at some not very distant time. It was a simple square building of white marble, with a dome-shaped roof. This roof had evidently received several blows from some sharp instrument, and was cracked and chipped in many places. A large portion of the masonry at one end had also been removed, and piled back against the spot where it had been broken open. An irresistible curiosity impelled me to displace the stones again, and see the inside of the chamber. The blocks were ponderous, and I dragged them out with difficulty. As I did so, one rolled down the slope, and fell crashing through the bushes 150 feet below, whereupon a number of gorgeous birds rose screaming into the air and flapped heavily away. What a fool I am, I said aloud, as I wiped the perspiration from my brow and paused to rest. What a fool I am to exhaust myself thus, when others have been before me, and have, no doubt, rifled the place of anything that might have been valuable. Well, never mind. Those others have, at all events, done the worst of the work, and I may as well see whether it was really a tomb, and whether the rest of them are likely to be worth our trouble hereafter. So I went on again with a will, and found to my satisfaction that when the 3 or 4 large marble blocks were fairly rolled away, only small stones and rubble remained. These were rapidly cleared out, and in about another quarter of an hour I had succeeded in making a space large enough to enable me to creep in. Having done so, and found that I could stand upright inside the building, I waited till my eyes had grown accustomed to the darkness. Gradually, as before, one object and then another became visible, and I found that the place was beyond all doubt a sepulchre. The inner chamber measured about 6 feet by 10, and was closed in by a ceiling about 3 inches above my head. The walls were lined with slabs of the purest alabaster, engraved all over with strange characters. The ceiling was rudely painted with representations of birds, fishes, plants, and beings half human and half brute. Some broken urns of dark blue pottery lay scattered about the floor, and at the farther end of the chamber, on a raised shelf of plain white marble, stood an alabaster coffer, the lid of which, shattered in a dozen fragments, lay close by. It was too dark for me to see to the bottom of this coffer, but I put my hand in and found it, as I had expected, empty. Just as I was withdrawing my fingers, however, they encountered a small object that felt like a pea. I seized and brought it to light. It was a fine pearl, somewhat discolored by the damp, but as large as an ordinary hollyberry. This discovery made my heart leap for joy, and rewarded me for all the trouble I had given myself to break into this tomb. The pearl itself was probably of no great value, but it was an earnest of what I might hope to find in those tombs which as yet had never been disturbed by previous adventurers. I put it inside my tinder-box for safety, and promised myself the pleasure of displaying it to the crew of the Mary Jane, in proof of the booty that awaited us. If there is treasure in the tombs, thought I, exultingly, what may we not hope to find in the temples and palaces? My head swam with visions of wealth. I pictured to myself temples with costly altars, and sacrificial vessels of gold and silver, palaces with unexplored apartments, containing thrones and royal furniture, and weapons studded with precious stones, tombs filled with gorgeous ornaments of buried kings. Aladdin's garden of jewels was not more lavish of wonder than became now to me the ruins of this forgotten city. Then came the bewildering thought that all the riches of this vanished race were mine. The island was unclaimed, uninhabited, unpossessed. It was mine to explore, to ransack, to plunder at my pleasure. I crept out of the tomb and exultingly breathed the fresh air again. I looked up at the great peak, which I could hardly be said to have even begun to ascend. The sun seemed as yet scarcely to have moved in the heavens, and the glorious day was still at its zenith. I sat down for a few moments to rest, and refreshed my parching throat with a few delicious purple berries that grew upon the bushes close beside me. Then I took out my pearl and examined it. Again in the open daylight. The sight seemed to stimulate me. I rose, replaced it in the box, and resumed my task. In a few minutes, I had left the last terrace and the last tomb below my feet, and had entered upon that part of the ascent where the rock grew steeper and was overgrown with thorny underwood, through which I had to force a passage as I could. I did force it, however, though my hands and face bled for it, and my clothes were well nigh torn to pieces on my back. Panting and exhausted, I at length fought through the belt of brushwood and emerged upon the bare rock above. Hence the barren peak rose, steep and sheer, some 1,200 feet above my head. At the sight of these awful precipices, my heart sunk within me. There was no visible footing for even a goat, as far as I could see, and scarce a twig or blade of grass for the climber to hold by. Thinking that it might possibly be less steep elsewhere, I contrived to work my way round more to the westward, and there, sure enough, found the commencement of what seemed like a gigantic staircase, hewn roughly out from the very substance of the rock. Each step of this ascent was from 3 to 4 feet in height. Some were cut in deep shelves, on which 3 or 4 persons could have lain down at length. Others were so narrow as scarcely to afford space for the foot, and many were quite broken away, which tenfold increased the difficulty of climbing. By the help, however, of perseverance, great natural agility, a cool head, and a resolute will, I sprang, clambered, and swung myself, somehow or another, from shelf to shelf of this perilous staircase, only pausing now and then to rest, and look down at the widening landscape. At length I found my feet on the last step and the summit, which had hitherto been hidden by the impending precipices, close above my head. That summit was artificially heightened by a kind of shelving platform, like a pyramid with the apex cut away. On the top of this platform stood a massive square building of white marble, with a large open entrance looking east, and this building served in turn as the pedestal to a gigantic idol which sat cross-legged and hideous, with its face to the setting sun. Sitting as it was, the image measured at least 20 feet in height, and wore on its head a large ornament of some strange and dazzling substance, which almost blinded me at first by its intolerable splendor. When I had somewhat recovered the command of my sight, I went nearer and examined it. To my amazement, I found this idol to be one incrustation of precious stones, from head to foot. The body was carved in jasper, the legs and arms in red onyx, the hands, feet, and face in the purest alabaster. Round its neck, inlaid upon the surface of the jasper ground, ran a rich collar of turquoises and garnets. Round its waist a belt of great emeralds, round its ankles, wrists, arms, and knees, elaborate bands of amethysts and opals. Each eye was represented by a ruby as large as a crown piece. From its ears hung enormous pendants of the purest sapphires, each the size of an ordinary hen's egg, and richly mounted in gold. Across its knees lay a golden scimitar, the hilt of which was carved from a single barrel, while on its head I stared, rubbed my eyes as if to be sure I was not dreaming, scaled the walls of the building, climbed the shoulders of the idol, examined it from every side, and came at last to the conclusion that this ornament, which I had taken for a beacon far away at sea, was no other thing than one pure, gigantic, inestimable diamond, such as the world had never seen before. It was almost spherical in shape, though slightly flattened, like the globe, at the two poles, was cut all over in the smallest facets, each of which reflected every color of the prism, and measured just 22 inches and a half in circumference. When I had in some degree recovered from the state of excitement and wonder into which this great discovery had thrown me, and was cool enough to look down at the scene below, I saw the whole island at my feet, as if drawn out upon a map. The smaller island lay close by, to the northwest, separated from this one by a strait of about 2 miles in width, and all around and about, from the verge of the beach below to the farthest limit of the horizon, stretched one rippling, sparkling, brilliant expanse of sapphire sea, unclouded by a breath of vapor, and unbroken by a single sail. I looked for the Mary Jane, but she was hidden by the cliffs that bounded the eastward coast in the direction where I landed. Then I took out my glass and made a careful observation of both islands. Scattered up and down the hills of the farther one, I saw the remains of various domed and pyramidal buildings, most of which appeared to be plated on the roofs and sides with gold, and glittered to the sun. Beneath my feet, reaching over a much greater extent of ground than I had at first supposed, lay the ruins of a vast number of palaces, temples, tombs, and triumphal arches, many of which, especially to the west side of the island, which I had not before seen, were in a high state of preservation, and richly decorated with gilding, painting, sculpture, and precious metals. In all of them, no doubt, were idols made after the pattern of this on which I was perched, so unceremoniously, and treasure of every imaginable description. However, as the present and actual were all that concerned me just then, so I left the investigation of the ruins till such time as I could bring my men to help me, and set to work with my clasp knife, to secure as much as possible of the spoil within my grasp. My first attack was made, of course, upon the diamond, which I dislodged with infinite difficulty, it being set into the head of the idol with some kind of very hard cement, that I had to grate to powder as I went on. When at last I had quite freed it, I tied it up in the Union Jack which had been all this time about my waist, and let myself down upon the east side of the building, where I had seen an opening into the basement. Looking inside this opening, I found the whole interior filled with human skulls, which somewhat startled me. I made room among them, however, for my diamond, and then climbed up again to secure a few more stones. This time I fell upon the idol's eyes and earrings, which I soon transferred to my own pockets, and having knocked out some of the great emeralds from his belt, and 1 or 2 of the largest opals from his bangles and bracelets, and taken possession of his golden scimitar for my own use, I made up my mind to rest from my labours for this day, and go back by the way I had come. So I tied the loose stones up with the diamond, secured the bundle to my belt, buckled the scimitar to my side, and prepared to descend the mountain. Loaded as I was now, however, this proved no easy matter, but I got to the bottom at last, after some perilous falls and scrambles, took the same route through the ruins, scaled the outer line of wall as before, and plunged into the forest. The sun was low in the heavens, and I was thoroughly exhausted by the mental and physical exertions of the day. I doubted whether it would be possible for me to reach the coast before sunset, and I stood in great need of food and rest. The shade and silence of the woods, the springy moss, offering a natural carpet to my feet, the cocoa-nuts and fragrant berries all around, were temptations not to be resisted. So I decided to spend the night in the forest, and proceeded to choose my lodging. A snug bank at the foot of a clump of banana and cocoa trees was soon found, and here, with a pile of cocoa-nuts by my side, my precious bundle at my feet, and my scimitar lying ready to my hand, I lay down, ate a hearty supper, and settled myself for the night. The sun went down upon the silence of the forest. Not a bird twittered, not a monkey chattered, not an insect hummed near. Then came darkness and the southern stars, and I fell into a profound sleep. I awoke next morning with the dawn, breakfasted on a coconut, drank the milk of 2 or 3 others, and set off, compass in hand, towards the coast. As I went along, I remembered all at once, with a sense of shame at having forgotten it till then, that it was the morning of Christmas Day, which, though summer-time out here in this tropical latitude, was a wintry epoch enough far away in England among those who loved me. Christmas Day, when the quiet, grey-turreted church in my native village would be garlanded with holly, when many a true heart would ache for my absence, when many a prayer for my safety would be whispered as the litany was read, and my health be drunk loudly at the Christmas feast, and what had I been doing all this time? Lost in ambitious dreams, had I given a single thought to those who gave so many thoughts to me? Had I longed for wealth, and dared danger and death, to share my riches with them and make them happy? My heart smote me at these questions, and I brushed away 2 or 3 remorseful tears. I saw how selfish had been my aims, and soothed my conscience with a number of good resolutions, all of which were to be carried out when I returned to England with a shipload of jewels and gold. Absorbed in these wholesome reflections, I traversed the mazes of the forest, crossed the flowery savannah, and threaded the majestic glades of the cocoa woods that lay nearest the shore. Emerging by and by, in sight of the beach and the sea, I saw, to my surprise and satisfaction, the Mary Jane, lying close up against the cliffs, in a little rocky cove not half a mile away. The next instant I had scrambled down the cliff as recklessly as if it had been a mere slope of smooth lawn, and was running towards the ship at my utmost speed, only pausing every now and then to shout and wave my hat, in case any of the crew were on the lookout for me. No answering shout, however, bade me welcome. Not a head appeared above the ship's side, not even a pennant fluttered from the masthead. Had the crew deserted the Mary Jane and gone up the island in search of treasure for themselves? At this thought I ran on again, breathless, but very angry. As I drew nearer, however, my anger gave place to a kind of terrified bewilderment. I hesitated, ran forward again, stood still, trembled, could not believe the evidence of my eyes, for at every step the aspect of the Mary Jane grew more strange and startling. She was lying high and dry upon the beach, a wreck. Her shrouds were hanging in shreds. Her hull was clustered thick with barnacles. Her sails were white with mould. Her anchor, broken and covered with rust, lay some yards off, half buried in the sand. Could she be the same little schooner that I had left only yesterday, as trim and stout as when she was turned out of the builder's yard? Was that indeed her name still visible in letters half effaced? Was I mad or dreaming? I had now come up close under her bulwarks. I walked slowly round and round her 3 or 4 times, quite dumb and stupefied. It was impossible that she could be the same ship. Her build, her size, her name, it is true, seemed precisely those of my little schooner. But common sense and the testimony of my own reason forbade me to believe that 24 hours could have done the work of 24 years. Here was a vessel that had been deserted for perhaps a quarter of a century, and had rotted where it lay. It was a coincidence, a strange, dramatic, incredible coincidence. Nothing more. I looked round for some means of clambering on board this ruin, and succeeded in finding the end of a broken chain. It hung rather short, but I caught it by a leap, and hauled myself up, hand over hand. In another moment I stood upon her deck. The timbers of that deck were all gaping and rotten, and overgrown with rank fungi. A sea-bird had built its nest in the binnacle. Some smaller nests, deserted and gone to wreck like the ship herself, clung to the rotten shrouds. One boat yet hung in its place, by ropes that looked as if a touch would break them to tinder. The other boat, just precisely the small one which would have been missing if this were indeed all that remained of the Mary Jane, was gone from its moorings. Curiosity, and something deeper than mere curiosity, took me down the crazy stairs and into the captain's cabin. It was a foot deep in water, and all the furniture was rotting away. The table yet held together, though spotted all over with white mould. The chairs had fallen to pieces and were lying in the water. The paper was hanging in black rags from the walls, and the presses looked ready to fall on the head of anyone who should venture to approach them. I looked round, amazed, upon this scene of desolation. Strange! Dilapidated and disfigured as the place was, it yet bore a weird and unaccountable resemblance to my own cabin on board the Mary Jane. My wardrobe stood in that corner of the cabin, just as this did. My berth occupied the recess beside the stove, just as this did. My table stood in the same spot, under the window, just as this did. I could not comprehend it. I turned to the table and tried the drawers, but the locks were rusty, and the wood had swollen with the damp, and it was only with the utmost difficulty that I broke away the surrounding woodwork and wrenched them out. They were filled with mildewed parchments, bundles of letters, pens, account books, and such other trifles. In one corner lay a mouldy looking-glass in a sliding cover. I recognized the little thing at once. Recognized it undeniably, positively. It had been given to me by my mother when I was a boy, and I had never parted with it. I snatched it up with a hand that trembled as if I had the ague. I caught sight of my own face reflected upon its scarred surface. To my terror, I saw that my beard and hair were no longer chestnut brown, but almost white. The glass fell from my grasp and was shattered to fragments upon the wet floor. Merciful heaven! What spell was upon me? What had happened to me? What strange calamity had befallen my ship? Where were my crew? Grey and old in one short day and night? My ship a ruin, my youth a dream, myself the sport of some mysterious destiny, the like of which no man had ever known before. I gathered the papers together from the table drawers, and staggered up on deck with them like a drunken man. There I sat down, stupefied, not knowing what to think or do. A frightful gulf seemed to lie between me and the past. Yesterday I was young. Yesterday I left my ship with hope in my heart and brown locks upon my head. Today I am a middle-aged man. Today I find my ship rotting on a desolate beach, the hair white upon my brow, and the future all a blank. Mechanically I untied one of the packets of letters. The outer ones were so discoloured that no writing remained visible upon them. They were mere folds of damp brown tinder, and fell to shreds as I unfolded them. Only two, which lay protected in the middle of the packet, were yet legible. I opened them. One was from my mother, the other from Bessie Robinson. I remembered so well when I read them last. It was the evening before that misty night when I met the Adventure with her cargo of gold and jewels. Fatal night! Accursed ship! Accursed and thrice accursed wealth that had tempted me from my duty and dragged me to destruction. I read the letters through, at least all that was legible of them, and my tears fell fast the while. When I had read them a second time, I fell upon my knees and prayed to God to deliver me. After this I felt somewhat calmer, and having laid the papers carefully aside, began to think what I should do to escape from my captivity. My first thought was of my crew. The men would seem to have abandoned the Mary Jane. Everything on board, so far as I could perceive, though rotting away, was untouched. There were no signs of plunder. Neither had they taken the ship's last boat in any attempt to put to sea on their own account. I looked down into the hold, and saw the great packing cases lying half under water, apparently undisturbed since the hour when I left the vessel. Surely, then, the men must have landed and gone up the island. In that case, where were they? How long had they been gone? What time had gone by since we parted? Was it possible that they could be all lost or dead? Was I absolutely and utterly alone in this unknown island, and was it my fate to live and die here like a dog? Alas, alas, of what use were diamonds and gold to me, if this were the price at which I was to purchase them? With these bitter reflections pressing on my mind, I roused myself by a great effort, and resolved that my first step should be to institute a thorough search for my men along the coast. In order to do this, it was necessary that I should find myself some place of temporary habitation, either in the wreck or on the shore, to which I could retire at night. Also that I should lay up a store of provisions for my daily use. I likewise determined to set up some kind of signals, here and there along the cliffs, to guide the men to me, if they were yet wandering about the island. My bundle of jewels, too, needed to be placed in a secure spot, lest any strange ship should find its way into the bay, and other treasure-seekers lay hands upon it. I looked round about me at the rotting timbers and the leaky cabin, and shuddered at the notion of passing a night on board the Mary Jane. The ship looked as if it must be phantom-haunted. It was, at all events, too remarkable an object to be a secure storehouse for my treasures, in case of the arrival of strangers. It was the first place they would ransack. Altogether, I felt it would be safer and pleasanter to stow myself and my jewels in some cavern along the cliffs. I had seen plenty on my way, and I determined to set off at once in search of what I wanted. So I went down again into the cabin to look for some weapon to carry with me, and having found a rusty marling spike and cutlass still hanging where I had left them behind the door, thrust them into my belt, slung my bundle over my shoulder, let myself down over the ship's side, and started for a walk under the cliffs. I had not gone far before I found just the spot I wanted. It was a deep cavern, about 3 feet above the level of the beach, the mouth of which was almost hidden by an angle of rock, and was quite invisible from some little distance. The inside of the cave was smooth, and carpeted with soft white sand. The walls were dry, and tapestried here and there with velvety lichens. In short, it was precisely such a retreat as best accorded with my present purposes. I took possession of it at once, by stowing away my bundle of jewels on a sort of natural shelf at the remotest end of the cave. I then traced a great cross in the sand before the entrance, that I might find my lodging again without difficulty, and went out to seek something in the shape of food and firewood. The first easy path up the face of the cliffs brought me to the outskirts of the palm forests. I climbed the nearest tree and flung down about 20 nuts. They were by no means such fine nuts as those farther in amid the woods, but I had taken a kind of superstitious horror of the interior of the island, and had no mind now to venture one step farther than was necessary. I then carried my nuts to the edge of the cliff, and rolled them over. By these means I saved myself the labor of carrying them down, and had only to pick them up from the beach, and store them in the cave, close under the shelf where I had hidden my jewels. By this time, in spite of my trouble, I was very hungry, but the sun was bending westward, and I was anxious to make another excursion to the ship before nightfall. So I promised myself that I would dine and sup together by and by, and so proceeded once more in the direction of the Mary Jane. What I wanted now was, if it were possible to find them, a couple of blankets, a hatchet to break up my coconuts, a bottle of some kind of spirits, and a piece of tarpaulin to hang at night before the entrance of my cavern. I hauled myself up again by the cable chain, and went down into the cabin. I found my bed a mere shelf full of rotten rags. If I hoped to find blankets anywhere, it must be among the ship's stores, in some place more protected from the damp. I forced open the locker in which I used to keep spirits. Here I was fortunate enough to discover 2 unopened cases of fine French brandy, apparently quite unspoiled. These I at once carried upon deck, and then let myself down into the hold. There I found several pieces of tolerably sound tarpaulin, and some packing cases on the top, which seemed comparatively dry. One of these, which I knew by the marks yet visible on the cover, ought to contain many valuable necessaries. I prized open with my marling-spike, and found filled with blankets, rugs, and other woolen goods. They were damp and spotted with mildew, but not rotten. I made 2 great bundles of the best that I could find, and laid them beside the spirit cases on the deck. Searching still farther, I came upon a box of carpenter's tools, an old horn lantern with about an inch of candle left in it, a small chopper, and a bag of rusty nails. There were plenty of barrels of ship's biscuits, pork, gunpowder, and flour in sight. But as they were all more or less immersed in water, I knew it would be a mere waste of time to inspect their contents. Besides, the sun was now declining fast, and I was anxious to carry all that I could to my cavern before the sudden tropical night should come. I then made 3 loads of my blankets, tarpaulins, spirit cases, tools, and so forth, lowered them over the ship's side one by one, and in 3 journeys conveyed them all to my cave before sunset. I had even then time to transport thither some large pieces of timber, the fragments probably of former wrecks, which were lying strewn about the beach. With these I made a good fire, which lighted up the inside of my dwelling, and enabled me to make myself quite comfortable for the night. To spread a warm bed of rugs and blankets, to nail up a large tarpaulin before my door, and to make an excellent supper of coconuts, cocoa milk, and a little brandy, were the occupations of my evening. As my fire began to burn low, I wrapped myself in my blankets, murmured a short prayer for safety and forgiveness, and fell sound asleep. I woke next morning with the sunrise, and started directly after breakfast upon my first expedition in search of the crew of the Mary Jane. All that day I travelled along the margin of the bay in a northwest and westerly direction, stopping every now and then to pile up a little cairn of loose stones that might serve as a signal. I returned to my cavern at dusk, having seen no sign of human footsteps or human habitation in any direction, and having walked, first and last, a good 20 miles at the least. This time I brought home some more firewood, and about half a bushel of mussels, which I had found clustered on the low rocks by the sea. I ate the mussels uncooked for my supper, and having a famous appetite, thought it the most delicious dish I had ever tasted. The next day, and the next again, and for many days after that, I persevered in my search, trying first north, and then east and south, and finding no trace of my crew. Wherever I went, I raised cairns along the beach and on the edges of the cliffs, and once or twice even laboured to carry up a piece of broken mast and a scrap of ragged canvas to some little headland, and so raised a kind of humble flagstaff where I thought it might be seen conspicuously from either sea or shore. I often stopped in these voluntary tasks to sit down and shed a torrent of bitter tears. At night I amused myself by shaping my cocoa shells into drinking cups and basins, and fitting up my cave with shelves and other little conveniences. I contrived, too, to vary my diet with cockles, mussels, and occasionally a young turtle, when I was so fortunate as to find one on the beach. These I ate sometimes boiled and sometimes roasted, and as I grew very weary of so much cocoa milk, I brought a leathern bucket from the wreck, and used to fetch myself fresh water from a spring about half a mile from home. I likewise searched out a kettle, a couple of hatchets, a pea-jacket but little the worse for damp, 2 or 3 pairs of shoes, a chest containing some uninjured stores of sugar and spices, some more cases of wine and spirits, and various other articles, all of which contributed essentially to my comfort. I also found 1 or 2 Bibles, but these were so much spoiled that no more than 20 or 30 leaves were legible in each. As these were not, however, the same in each book, I found I had between 70 and 80 readable leaves, in all about 155 pages printed in double columns, the perusal and possession of which proved a great blessing to me in my lonely situation, and gave me strength, many and many a time, to bear my trial with fortitude, when I should otherwise have sunk into utter despair.